this is as excited as I get, which is very excited.
I'm Joe, he's Greg, that's Eric, and this is the One Accord Podcast. And on today's episode of the Biblical Theology Project, we're planning to discuss Exodus chapters 12 and 13. And so before we get right into the text, why don't we go ahead and see how everybody's doing? Greg, how are you today? Last week you said you were having a tough week. Things going better this last week?
Things are different this week for sure. Yeah, no, it's
that is not a yes.
That's not a yes, but it's not a no either. Just big families, sicknesses, stomach bugs, and busy weekends, and so I'm always excited for Monday mornings after the show because I shift into neutral and just coast to Friday, and so I'm looking forward to that.
That gives me the impetus to want to shift this to a daily show so that we'll do it instead of once a week. There's no coasting.
We talked about that, didn't we? We talked about a daily show.
I'm interested. It'd be fun. But anyway, no coasting for you. So I guess that's why we always have to say no to it, because Greg needs his coasting time.
I do need coasting time. Yeah, no, I'm doing great. Happy to be here. Happy to be talking. You said we're planning to do 12 and 13. Are we not doing 12 and 13? That's.
I mean, Lord willing. I hope I don't have a heart attack or you don't start throwing up or something. But as long as everything goes according to our plan, this episode will be Exodus 12 and 13. If it isn't, I'll change the title so at least people have some heads up coming into it. But Eric, how about you? How you doing this week?
Doing well. Got some exciting things coming up. Some evangelism stuff, and
you look excited.
Yeah, this is as excited as I get, which is very excited.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff on the horizon. I'm excited to share the gospel in different ways and lead other people to do it too. So I got a lot to be thankful for, a lot to look forward to, and we get to see Greg tomorrow too. But that's
Cool. You get to watch it. You get to see him in coasting mode, so that'll be very exciting. So
that's right.
Well,
it's not true, by the way. Just in case my boss is watching.
Greg works hard. He's a hardworking guy, so he's the one. Remember, who's always saying lazy to everybody else.
I don't even know where that came from.
Yeah. Anyway, why don't we go ahead and dive into Exodus chapter 12?
Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. But on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from that day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the 7th day. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread, until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an alien or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, What does this rite mean to you? You shall say, It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshipped. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go, worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go, and bless me also. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We will all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt, and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out from the land of Egypt. This night is for the Lord, to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat of it, but every man's slave purchased with money, after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. Then all the sons of Israel did so. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that same day the Lord brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts.
Well, as this chapter begins and ends with a lengthy description about the Passover meal, obviously as New Testament followers of Jesus Christ, we all have some thoughts about what this means, but let's try and set that aside What did they understand about this meal as this is being described to them at this point in the narrative here in Exodus 12?
Well, I think their knowledge was based on just simply what was said to them. I don't think we can assume that they knew any more than just what was spoken to them and in the way that it was spoken. Now, the Israelites did understand the concept of offering sacrifices to God. Remember, the story it begins, at least earlier in the story, we read in Exodus chapter 3, verse 18, it says, they will pay heed to what you say, and you, with the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now, please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And it sounds like that command was understood. They understood what it meant to make sacrifices to God. They understood the concept. And if you read, of course, we've already read earlier in Genesis, where other people were making sacrifices to God, even as early as Abel was making animal sacrifices to God, and there are other examples. So the Israelites definitely understood the concept of sacrificing. They obviously knew that the lamb's blood on the lintel and doorposts of their houses would protect them against the destroyer. I think some translations might say destroying angel, but either way, God was going around, destroying or killing the firstborn, at least of the Egyptians. And so they understood that if we apply this blood, if we put the blood on the lintel and doorposts of our house, then we'll be protected from that and no one will die. So they had to have understood that the lambs were killed in their place so they could live. The blood of the lambs protected them from this destroyer, from this plague.
I mean, again, I'm no historian, but you don't see this as a new development. Like, I completely agree with you that we had sacrifice, and but at least biblically, this is the first time we've seen sacrificial blood as a covering, as a protectant, or I don't know how we want to phrase it, but sacrificial blood turning away the destroyer. This is, at least biblically, again, not being an expert in all of the pagan rituals that were. You see this as something they would have expected or been familiar enough with?
That's a really good question, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think the example that came into my mind as I was thinking about this earlier is when Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac, and God provided a ram in the place of Isaac, so the ram was slain. And then Isaac was, in a sense, delivered because of the slain ram. But again, that's just one isolated story. That's not like a broad concept that may have been understood by a bunch of people. So that's an excellent question. And I mean, no doubt this was new in a sense. I mean, we don't ever read about anyone wiping blood on the lintel and doorposts of their houses. Yeah. So I mean, this is the first time I'm assuming that something like that has ever happened.
It'd be really interesting. Like, again, not being
it's a great question.
Yeah, not being an expert in this, I wonder how much in past sacrifices, how much was it appeasing God, making God happy, versus an atoning sacrifice of blood? I don't know the answers to those things, and I agree that the Abraham and Isaac is an interesting example of that lamb in place of. But yeah, I don't know. I'm asking questions, not proposing answers there.
Certainly, as we're reading this, we're getting new information. But the point, I think, Eric, maybe I'm misunderstanding your point, but what the full extent of what everybody knew leading up to this, we just don't know. And I've made that point similarly before when we were having the conversation about, did they know this name of God or did they not? What's new in the story? What is maybe old information? What's new information? So, we certainly haven't seen. I mean, this is a sign that is very particular to this group of people for sure. And spreading blood to have God's, wrath or judgment pass over them. Certainly, we've never read anything like that. I mean, that's for sure. What was the purpose of some of these other sacrifices? Eric, you listed a few of them. What were they doing? What was their intent when they were doing this? I guess we just don't know the answers to those questions. So, but to get back to your first point before we kind of ran down this little bunny trail, Eric, if I was picking up what you were laying down, you said, they weren't necessarily thinking about this as like some long range messianic prophecy. They were expecting this to be fulfilled based on something happening very imminently for them, and probably not much else, with the exception of they're just supposed to do this in the years to come to remember this event that happened. Was that kind of the gist of your primary answer to the question?
Yeah, I don't see any reason to believe that they took it any further than just what was plainly spoken to them at the time.
Sure. You made another point, which I thought was interesting. I think I just briefly looked at some other translations. It looks like to me it's like the NLT only is the one that talks about the destroying angel. But verse 23 and then earlier on, I mean, God says that he is going through. I'm the Lord. I will go through. I will strike these things down. I will strike them down. And so it kind of gets us to another potentially related conversation to what we had, like what was going on with the burning bush. The angel of the Lord's there, here the destroyer. We're seeing agency, that they're at least acting on behalf of the Lord with his authority, so much so that he can say, I am doing this. But it's an interesting question. I don't know. Maybe we could dive into that if you guys have more thoughts. I'm just making the observation. I don't necessarily have anything profound to add to that. But Greg, I know you kind of interesting conversation on the bunny trail. Do you have other thoughts on just what they were expecting? Because I mean, your point's a good one. This does seem new. And so what did they understand about this at the time? Certainly, we understand this with a more messianic implication.
Sure.
Naturally, that's how we naturally read this. But let's try and take us out of our natural mindset and say, what were they understanding and expecting at this point?
Yeah, I don't see, from the text and from what we've read so far, I don't see any reason why they would have expected this to be some type looking for a future fulfillment or a future building upon this. Everything that we get here is a look back. Remember this, look back. Tell what this meant, not tell what this means or is going to mean. And so I think that's very interesting, especially it'll be interesting as we get closer to fulfilling some of these things and what we're still looking forward to as to what we're looking back on. It's quite astonishing to me when we read the text like this, because we are so used to reading it through our New Testament lens, where everything always meant that, and why wouldn't it mean that?
It's hard to get out of that mindset for sure.
Yeah.
And some of the conversation, that we've had over these past few videos, just as we've been going through Exodus, I thought was, really interesting. Eric, you had made some points that I'd never heard of or considered. I think, Greg, you made that same observation, and it'll kind of lead us into our next question. But something that I think about as we think about these signs, obviously we do have a New Testament understanding. We're all trying to not, abide by the rules that we've set for ourselves, in this biblical theology project. But we know that, God chose this particular sign for a very major reason in revealing the Messiah down the road. But some of the conversation that, especially Eric, I remember that you were bringing up about the plagues as we were going through them, was tied to the conduct of the Egyptians towards the Israelites. And Greg, I know that you had asked some questions. You hadn't really thought about it that way before. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. But it is interesting to think, what would they be thinking? Maybe they are thinking simply retroactively. Well, God's doing all these things because of what the Egyptians did to us, and not thinking about what it will mean in the future. And of course, it's not too hard for God to do both, to try and make something that's very meaningful to them in the moment, and then also lay groundwork for something that's going to happen down the road, which will be very meaningful for all of us as we look back at the whole redemptive scope of what God is doing. And I anticipate, because God knows the future and we don't, we can only look back with hindsight. It's very difficult for us to, consider the future. Even when he tells us what's going to go on, we know, as we've discussed eschatology and stuff, it's difficult for us to even sort through those issues when he's told us what's going to happen. But for God, it's easy. He knows what's to come. We should probably expect more signs that have import for the group that received them. And as we go through this, let's try and focus on that. And then when we get more import, say in the New Testament, for example, we'll be able to really unfold all of the fullness of the sense of what God was doing And I think that increases our awe of him, that he would do something like this that was so meaningful for this group. Obviously, they're about to go through something incredibly meaningful. And then also to see how it's fulfilled even later is, I think, pretty neat. It is that anticipatory stuff that we have to look forward to. So you guys have any other thoughts on this before we move to the next one? Because it kind of does link these things together about the statement that God said he was going to execute judgments on the gods of Egypt. But you guys got anything else on this first question before we press forward?
No, I don't think so.
All right. So in verse 12, God does say that he's going to bring judgment or execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. What did that mean? How could God do this? Is God validating that these gods are real gods? Any other thoughts and comments you have on this statement in verse 12?
Well, I see two ways to understand this statement, and I think the second one is more likely. I'll just give you a heads up right away. But the Egyptians did believe that some animals were incarnated gods. That was a I think a distinct misunderstanding of the Egyptians. I'm not sure. Maybe other groups believed similar things, but we know the Egyptians did believe that some animals were incarnated gods. I think like cats is one example. I think cows or there were some others. So killing all the firstborn of beasts could have been viewed as a judgment against their gods if they're killing animals that were viewed as gods in a sense. That would be, of course, a judgment on their gods. That's one possibility. I think the second one is probably more likely, and I think God may have destroyed all the idols in the land of Egypt that night. The Egyptians had all kinds of idols that they created, and God could have gone through the land that night and demolished them. And I think if my reading is correct, I think that's how the Jews understood this judgment. And I think that makes the most sense based on what the verse says, because the judgment against the gods of Egypt seems like it's separate from the killing of the firstborn, because it says, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. So it sounds as if it sounds like he's saying the killing of the firstborn and the judging of the gods of Egypt, they're like two different things. At least that's the way that I'm reading it. So for that reason, I think that the latter interpretation is probably true, and that does seem to be the way that the Jews understood the judgment.
Yeah, there's actually, in my mind, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm trying to figure out how to unpack it well. First, I don't see this as two different things. Like, as I read verse 12, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. I don't necessarily, could you be right? Are there two different things there? Sure, very well. The way I read the text, I see those things as coincident. They aren't different events, but rather the same event. But that gets me to, okay, presumably the Egyptians, whether or not, okay, back up. I want to grant the possibility that there are some demonic influences behind what the Egyptians believe. Like, do I believe Ra, for instance, is a god? No. Do I allow the possibility that there is some demonic influence that presented himself, masquerading as an angel of light, presented himself as the god of light and called himself Ra? That possibility might exist. That's not necessarily how I read this text. How I read this text is, I am going to execute a judgment against all the idols that these Egyptians have manufactured in their hearts and in their minds. I am going to humble the people through the execution of this judgment in such a way that they cannot deny me, God, as superior over and against their gods. And now this judgment, this firstborn of both cattle and beast, I guess I never saw that through because animals could be incarnate gods. I just saw that, or I see that as a discrimination. God's going to kill, and he's not killing indiscriminately. This isn't, carpet bombing. He is very purposefully, in a very sovereign, controlled way, going to go through and pick out the firstborn of every house, of every animal, in a way that it would be one thing if a plague swept through the city and randomly 10%, 50%, 75% of the people died. But for this destroyer to come through and say, this one and not this one and not that one, that speaks of a sovereignty that goes beyond, I think, what would have been considered normal sovereignty for gods.
Do you guys think that there's any possibility of reading this, even that this is a culminating statement that as God is about to do this final judgment, that he's not just talking about this last thing, but he's talking about all the judgments that, most of which we talked about in our last video. And I think that some of the conversation that you guys brought up, some of the, the gods that they had about, maybe a god of the Nile and a god of the wind and a god of some other things, that some of the very specific activities leading up to that point were specific to show that not only was God sovereign over life and death, and even in the point that you were just making there, that God could choose this one and not that one, but that he had done all these things. It's the judgments, it is plural. Some make it singular, but he will execute judgments, it says. It's imperfective, and so it's not necessarily future. It says, I'm executing judgments, or I have been executing judgments, that this might be the final one that has shown God's sovereignty over all these things. Do you think that that's too much of a stretch, or do you think that is...
in my mind, this is a capstone that's built upon all the rest. That this isn't an isolated incident, if you will.
Eric, you have any thoughts on that? Or
That's a good question. To be completely honest with you, I'm not totally sure. I'd have to give a little bit more thought, but I just on the spot, I don't know that I could come up with an excellent answer for that.
Yeah, so some, there are obviously the saying "I will execute" sounds future for us, and that is, if that is the case, then this last judgment that is about to happen is the one that is clearly in view. Usually when it says that, it says, I will execute judgment, singular. The New American Bible has an interesting translation of this. That's typically a Catholic translation. But he says, in executing judgment on all the gods of Egypt, I, the Lord. So it takes the imperfective aspect of saying and executing judgment, kind of in that ongoing nature of it, although it still makes judgment singular. So this is one of those areas where translation is interesting, and certainly the English translation that we're reading will influence those thoughts. I'm not going to plant a flag either way. Again, I wanted to ask the question and just see, does that seem like a possibility, that, especially considering some of the reasoning that you guys had brought up before? I don't typically read them that way because I don't know much about the gods of ancient Egypt. Obviously, the people living there would have known. You live in a culture for 400 years. You know a lot about the customs of the gods of the land. And so specifically, even some of the laws that I'm sure we'll see when God finally brings us out, sometimes it has to do with the gods of the people in that region. You say, well, why this law? This law doesn't make any sense. Well, sometimes it's simply a prohibition of what other people were doing, and you and I might never think to do that because that's not what our culture does. But in that culture, the culture around them was doing that, so they weren't to participate. I guess I'll take a half a demerit for that for that thought.
Well, I think one thing that we have seen so far is not only the expectation that small g gods have some sovereignty over the Nile or over wind or whatnot, but we've also seen regional gods, and we've also seen household gods. So in this statement, going to execute judgments against the gods of Egypt, is he talking about, I'm going to go into these households and their household gods who they expect to protect them? I am going to show myself greater than the God of that house and the God of that house and the God of that house. And so in performing this act, proving himself over and against every one of those little gods that don't even make it on the list of, Ra and whatever. I'm forgetting all the others that I once upon a time knew, but
probably for the best.
Probably it's not
Horus, Set.
Horus. Yeah, Set. There you go. Yep. Yay that. Not yay that.
Eric, we'll give you the last word on this if you want it.
I would, yeah, it's interesting. I guess what I said earlier is basically just kind of where I'm at, and I would want to look into it a little bit more and just to be sure. It's kind of worth, it's worth considering. This is one of those things where, like you said, I'm not going to plant a flag. I would be open to exploring that possibility a little bit more.
Well, it seems like at the very least, I said I'd give you the last word, but this is maybe a summary just of kind of, maybe we muddied the waters. For clarity, Greg said he views this as a capstone judgment. Eric, I would be shocked if you didn't think this was as well. And I think it was probably 2 episodes ago, God said this is what he was leading up to anyway. So everything in between and everything that he was doing was always leading up to this. So this is the main demonstration of God's sovereignty and power. And this is the one that finally will allow them to actually make their way out. And that's kind of what God was leading up to. So at least with all the other minutia that we might get lost in, I think we all agree on that point. Yes? Or does anybody disagree with that part?
Yep.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Fair enough. So we can move on. This chapter is not just about the Passover, but also then about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's described basically in verses 14 to 20. We get a lot of instructions regarding this. What was the purpose of this feast as you guys see it?
I think it's really it's fascinating to me how why God tells people to do some of the things that they do. Why some people might read the law. We'll read the law later on. We're not there yet, but God's law that He gave to Israel. I mean, and it's people read some of these things, and actually, this is the law. This is included in the law. It's part of it. And some people might think, man, this is just kind of weird. Why would God tell people to do some of these things? It seems confusing to us. But if you know Israel's history and you know what God did for them, it makes a lot of sense. Because God says this feast was a permanent ordinance. That is, it was to be observed every year. Its purpose was to remind Israel of their exodus from Egypt. That's mentioned in 12:17, where it says, "You shall also observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance." So God wanted Israel to remember what He had done for them. I think that was the main point. They were to remember God's power. They were to remember God's love, His ability to deliver them from their enemies. Remember, this was, among other things, this was an answer to prayer. They were crying out to God for help, and God delivered them. God answered their prayer. And there's maybe a broader application, because it's still important for all of us to remember what God has done for us. And I don't mean to get too personal about this, but because this applies specifically to Israel. God did this for Israel, and so this was a specific thing, and it was a specific meal or a festival. But I think all of us need to take something from this. We need to keep in mind the things that God has done for us, and that helps us to maintain love and gratitude toward God. I think that's why God had Israel have this festival, because He wanted them to keep these things in their minds. It's so easy for us to just lose sight of what God has done in our lives and for us, and we do other things as Christians to remember what God has done for us. So I think Israel, I think that was the main point. God saying, don't forget what I've done for you, and if you don't forget, you'll continue to have gratitude, and you'll continue to have love toward me. I think that was the main reason why God wanted them to do this.
I see Greg smiling over there. I think he thinks that you're eager to get that other half of demerit that I just handed out. But
oh no, not at all.
You thought he was going. I thought you thought he was going.
Not at all.
To be explicit. No. Oh, okay. Well,
no,
what were you smiling about then? I misinterpreted that smirk.
When he had said we do other things to remember what the Lord has done, my mind went to Christmas, and I wanted to say, well, like some of us do those things, but some of us fail to do those.
I thought he was talking about baptism and communion. And
I'm sure he was talking about those things, but in my mind, it went to.
Oh, you were thinking about the made up stuff.
Yeah,
the stuff that he never told us to do.
Go ahead.
No,
After you, sir.
It's your thought. You have to have some other thing.
Do I have to have a thought? I don't have
on
to
the
have
unleavened the unleavened bread. You got no thoughts on this?
I have thoughts. No, you've completely disrupted my thought. I think this is a great reminder, especially for us today. We are a people who are fascinated with looking forward, right? Like you don't have to go far before you'll find Christians who all they want to talk about is whatever vein of eschatology they are into and looking forward to whatever that holds for them. And now I'm not against looking forward. I think we ought to be looking forward. I will argue for the importance of looking forward, but this ought to be at least instructive to us in that even here in this great sign that we all agree, we all just know that is going to have huge future implications. It was never about looking forward. It's about looking back and remembering. And so, yeah, I'm going to echo what Eric had to say. If you, as we read the New Testament, or excuse me, as we read through the Old Testament in this project, we're going to come across so many times where we are retold this history over and over and over again. I made the comment once that, like, I think our Bibles would be half as thick if we took out all the repetition of the history. And God has to be doing that for a reason, so that we remember, so that we look back. Because, quite frankly, looking forward can often be discouraging, because we just keep looking and we just keep looking and we just keep hoping and we just keep sitting here arguing with one another about what the future is going to look like. Instead of doing that, as we look forward to this future hope, wouldn't it be so much more encouraging to look back at what God has done as opposed to whatever it is we think he's going to do in the future?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of when people remake Psalms or something like that, a lot of times some of that history that you're talking about that if we eliminated might reduce significantly the length of our Bible. That's the stuff that people cut out. And, there are, as we've talked about before, and I know I've mentioned it many times, there are huge portions of Christianity today that want to completely eliminate the Old Testament and the history of what God has done. And clearly God was repeating himself for a reason on all these issues. It wasn't just because he loves repeating himself, but these are important for us to understand. And think about the life of these people, right? They were in Egypt for more than 400 years. Looking forward was probably very difficult. Even at this point when they were receiving this, they still haven't experienced the deliverance yet. And yet, if they looked back to see what God was faithful to do before, that probably would have given them some strength. But if they're looking at their present or looking at just what their eyes would think, well, what does the future hold? It's bleak at best. But then God does something amazing. And so looking back to these moments where God has said that he's going to do something, and then when he fulfills his word, again, it doesn't always happen in our lifetime. And so, what if you were the generation that was 300 years in, 200 years in? Looking back would have been one of the best things that you could do for your own faithfulness to the Lord, who was faithful to do everything that he said, but you might have died without seeing the fulfillment. Doesn't mean that God didn't do it. It just means that, if you were constantly waiting for it, you'd be living a life of hopelessness and disappointment because it didn't go the way you thought it should. A related question to this, and Greg, I'm sorry for distracting you. Your point was a good one, so I'm sorry for ruffling your feathers.
That's the only one that I have, so
you ruined it. I tried to ruin it by mistake, so I'm sorry about that. But related to this, so I think we're all in agreement about the importance of what God was doing here and what he was saying here, and getting them to look back. He's about to do it, but then from that point forward, they're supposed to do this on an annual basis to remember back to what God did. Eric, you mentioned that because he brought them out, with haste. I have often heard, and I'm sure that you guys have as well, and I'm not trying to run us ahead, in the demerit sense, but just as an applicational point, and when people talk about the Bible, I've often heard people that infuse various symbols that we encounter, and always, it's almost like a search and replace. So maybe you guys have heard this, oil is the Holy Spirit or something like that. And somebody, every time somebody reads about oil, they go, oh, it's the Holy Spirit. I've heard this about leaven, that leaven is about sin. Is there anything in this that the removing the leaven has anything to do with sin, or does this Feast of Unleavened Bread, the symbolism of this, why God used this sign for them to be his remembrance? If it's not about sin, what is it about? Or is it about sin? Are they supposed to put, quote unquote, sin out of their house for a week and then bring it back in for the other, for the rest of the year? What is the symbolism of the unleavened bread as we're reading it right here in Exodus 12?
Well, in Exodus 12, I think it unquestionably refers to the haste in which Israel left Egypt, or they were to leave Egypt. We haven't got there quite yet, but but that was the purpose of it. I think a good rule to use is you should only. I want to be careful how I say this. I think it's safe to assume that something is symbolic of maybe more than what it plainly says. It's safe to assume that if you read that in the New Testament or somewhere else. If you don't read that anywhere else in the Bible, I would be cautious about assuming that it means more than what it's plainly saying. So I think that's a good principle. But if our viewers want to read ahead in the New Testament, they may stumble upon this concept. So I'll just leave it at that for now. I want to avoid some demerits.
But let me ask you a question. So let's say we read ahead, and somewhere, whether later in the Old Testament or later in the New Testament, somebody uses leaven in one context to say that in this particular case is about sin. Does that mean that we read about it here? That they're supposed to get, again, sin out of their house for 1 week, and that's the symbolism? Or do you think it, in this context, it tells us it's about haste? I agree with you on that. And so should, in this context, it remain haste, even if in another context, leaven is used as a symbol of something else in a different context?
The latter. Yeah. So I don't. So here's one way in which symbolism could be used. So like, there could be an event, okay, an event in Israel's history, and someone in the New Testament could be using that event as analogous to a spiritual truth, without saying that was the original intention of the event, if that makes any sense. So like, okay, let's just take, we're talking about the Passover. We're talking about unleavened bread. So I think that here, the unleavened bread was meant to show the haste in which the Israelites left Egypt. I don't take it any further than that here. But if someone in the New Testament, if some writer in the New Testament uses it in an analogous kind of way, or says, this is comparable to, sin or whatever. Okay, that they can use it in that way without saying that was the original meaning in the Old Testament. If that makes any sense, I hope it does.
I think I'm with you. Greg, what do you think on this?
Yeah, I'm going to generally agree with you guys. We should, especially when we get to the New Testament, when we see analogies or when we see parables, is it possible that leaven could be used in a way to mean sin? Yeah, and we should allow the context of those statements to guide our understanding of those statements. And we should allow the context of Exodus chapter 12 to guide our understanding here. That said, this entire setup is meant to be symbolic, and it is like the Passover meal is symbolic of something that we might read about in the future. And so is the unleavened bread caught up in the umbrella of what's being symbolized that we'll understand better in the future? I don't want to slam the door to that possibility. And now, yeah, I'll leave it there. I think that this entire thing, we would agree, has symbolism, and I don't know that the symbolism ends just at the lamb, or if the unleavened bread gets caught up into the greater symbolism that's happening.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that. Again, my urging and caution for anybody who cares about my opinion on biblical interpretive matter is that just because in one passage or in one context something means something, that doesn't mean that then we read that into every other context. That's true. Absurd. We wouldn't do that with somebody's name. If we have somebody that's named something, we don't, the figures in the New Testament aren't the same figures in the Old Testament just because they bear the same name. That would be ridiculous. These people are separated by time and everything else. And yet we do that with concepts. And, many biblical teachers, they twist, I think, the scriptures all up. And so leaven as a a thing, a real thing that has real principles, it shouldn't be shocking to us that someone might say, hey, be careful with sin, because like leaven, a little bit can maybe, influence more than you realize. But we might also see leaven used of good things, like, say, the kingdom of God, that likewise, it goes, and so, well, wait, is the kingdom of God sin? Because, leaven is sin. Like it becomes preposterous at some point. And so we're told why this. God isn't interested in saying, listen, leaven's like sin. It's always good to have some little sin in your house. But for 1 week in the year, let's get rid of it all because you had to leave Egypt in haste. That's nonsense, and it's silly. But to think about the fact that God was doing all these judgments, he was doing all these judgments, things were getting bad, and then quickly they had to leave. That's what the symbolism is about. And I don't think that there's anything that we could read in the New Testament that will change this symbolism. This symbolism is set. Could we add additional understanding about things using similar symbols? Could a lamb be something else? Is a lamb always something that must be killed? Well, maybe. But could a lamb also have some other use? Sure, it could. And we might see a teacher or a biblical image that uses a lamb in a way that isn't about to be slain and have its blood, spread on the lintels in the doorposts. So again, every context sets itself, and that's my urging for anybody who cares about my opinion. And I appreciate your guys' thoughts on this as well. For the sake of time, let's move forward. This passage also tells us that as God brought these Israelites out of Egypt, verse 38 says that a mixed multitude went up with them. How do you guys understand this phrase? Why do you think that this mixed multitude went with Israel out of the land? What does this teach us, if anything, about God's view of maybe, depending on how you interpret that phrase, what does this tell you about God's attitude towards this group that's coming out? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm assuming, just based on, I guess, what's reasonable to assume, or at least in my opinion, this multitude probably consisted of Egyptians, slaves from foreign countries, or even maybe prisoners of war. Obviously, Egypt was a warring people. They conquered some other nations. So I think probably the mixed multitude was made up of all these different groups. And they were probably very impressed with the miracles that God had done and decided to follow Israel's God as opposed to the gods of Egypt. And that would be my guess. Seems like the context makes that pretty easy to believe. And that God accepted these people is not at all surprising, because we've read about God's love for all nations, all people, already in Scripture. For example, God promised Abraham that in him all the families of the earth would be blessed, all of them. So from the very beginning, God intended to bless all people, not just the nation of Israel. And so it's not surprising that God welcomed this mixed multitude. And they actually, it even says, notice, I meant to include this originally, and for some reason it just went out of my mind, but it came right back in. Notice the instructions about observing the Passover include things like, for example, in verse 48, but if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. That's according to Genesis 17. And then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. So here God's saying, foreigners, people from other nations, they're welcome to come and celebrate this with you. But they have to do it in the proper way. They have to be circumcised, because that was according to the covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants. So, clearly, the Passover was not limited to the Israelites. All people were welcome to come and celebrate it. But they had to do it according to God's law.
Yeah, the NET Bible does have a note that says, this is a great swarm of people. This would be, as Eric pointed out, non-Israelites, possibly Egyptians who were brought to faith, if you will, as they saw these signs that God did, or possibly other slaves, other prisoners, whatnot. We don't know. But yeah, no, I I think I think that God's open door for other nations joining with Israel was much more open than many times we like to think about today. This is, yes, you could join yourself, and perhaps there will be very notable instances coming up soon of people who didn't belong to Israel, but were very importantly made members of Israel.
Yeah, so the motivation of this mixed multitude probably was mixed. Some people maybe did believe based on the signs. Others maybe just were, hey, I guess the slaves are getting out of here, so let's go ahead and join this caravan out of town. That sounds pretty good. And so for our last question for this chapter, back in Genesis 15:13, we read a prophecy that they would be enslaved and oppressed in a foreign land for 400 years. Exodus 12:40 tells us that they came out on 430 years to the very day. Is that a contradiction? Was God's prophecy or prediction wrong? Is there a significant difference between 400 years and 430 years? How do you guys read this passage?
It's about 30 years different.
That's good math.
Roughly.
Did you do that? Did you need a piece of paper with that one? Or?
I did study math in college.
And now you're just showing off.
I am just strutting my stuff.
Yeah. Impressive. Well, there are at least two ways to resolve this alleged contradiction. I don't see it as a contradiction at all. Actually, there's more than two, but it gets a little bit technical with some of the others. But I just want to share two really simple ways I think this can be resolved. The first way is God may have simply rounded down to 400 when speaking to Abraham. God spoke to Abraham long before this, and there was just no reason for God to be so precise about the amount of time with when he was talking to Abraham. So that's one way to resolve that. God was using a round number 400 because it's just meant to be a number that could be remembered. That's one possibility. The second possibility is that in Genesis 15:13 and Exodus 12 verse 40 are not necessarily talking about the same thing. They are in one sense, but not in another. Genesis refers specifically to the amount of time Israel would be enslaved and oppressed in Egypt, but the verse in Exodus speaks of the amount of time Israel lived in Egypt. So Israel could have lived in Egypt for 430 years and only been enslaved and oppressed 400 of those years. So there's really no great reason to believe that a contradiction, there's no reason to believe that a contradiction exists between these verses. I think either way works just fine. A contradiction would mean it is impossible to harmonize these two verses, and there's actually more ways even than that. But those two ways I think are satisfactory.
Yeah, I guess I always considered it on the other end, like did the years stop counting when God started moving with Abraham or with Moses? I never thought about it on the back end, meaning they weren't enslaved for those first few years. So I find that equally as actually probably more satisfactory than my assumption. But what I've always worked with is just the level of specificity. When God says 400 years, is 430 close enough? Is it? I guess I don't think about it as rounding, but just a level of precision. If I'm going to predict something 400 years from now, and I say 400 and it's 430, in my mind, you've hit the target. And what was the purpose of God's statement to Abraham about predicting the precise date, or was it about telling him they're going to be in the land for 400 years? And they were in the land for 400 years. As a matter of fact, they were there 430 years. And so I've just, and we have to imagine we've seen this so far before as, I'm trying to remember, have we seen number of cattle that somebody owned? I mean, 400,000 sheep. Well, was it 400,000 or was it 400,001? You don't know, do you? Well, again, is that the point here? Is the point to communicate? It was the point when the prophecy was given to Abraham to communicate the exact date the exact precise time that they're going to come out, or to tell him they're going to be there a while.
Yeah.
And so that's how I read it.
Yeah, I think all these comments are fair. And so it is funny when, the statement that God said is, he didn't say, you will be in Egypt exactly 400 years, not a moment more, not a moment less. And so, we use terminology like this all the time. If you say someone's a millionaire, that means that they've crossed that threshold, that they have above $1 million, not less. And so if someone's a multimillionaire, you could have all the way up to 1.999 million and not be a multimillionaire. You need to cross that threshold into 2. Now you're a multimillionaire. But there's a lot of threshold above that as well. So we have many numbers like this that indicate. And so they were not going to be in the land for less than 400 years oppressed and enslaved. And 430 is certainly not less than that. And so we'd have to be, I think, really ungracious to say that this is a contradiction. Now, could God have been more specific? He could have. And all the solutions, though, that you gave, Eric, at the beginning, those are at least possible reconciliations of that. If we are trying to hold God even to a very specific number, perhaps their enslavement and oppression lasted only exactly 400 years, because there was some time when they lived in the land when they didn't move in and immediately get oppressed. That didn't happen. So those are at least reasonable propositions. But it is funny when people try and cause problems that I don't know. I mean, we don't hold ourselves to that normal standard, and I guess, well, he's God, so he could have said, he could have. And there are some places where God is very specific, but we don't need to read something that is more general as more specific, or something that is more specific as more general. That's, again, bad, ungracious interpretive practice. So, well said. Why don't we jump into chapter 13?
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and beast. It belongs to me. Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. On this day, in the month of Abib, you are about to go forth. It shall be when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall observe this rite in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leaven shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in all your borders. You shall tell your son on that day, saying, It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt, and it shall serve as a sign to you on your hand, and as a reminder on your forehead, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall keep this ordinance at its appointed time from year to year. Now when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you, and to your fathers, and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck, and every firstborn of men among your sons you shall redeem. And it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, What is this? Then you shall say to him, With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. It came about, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. So it shall serve as a sign on your hand and as phylacteries on your forehead. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Now when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said, The people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea. And the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones from here with you. Then they set out from Succoth and camped in Etham, on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night, from before the people.
So why was Israel required to sanctify all of their firstborn to God?
Yeah, another another interesting thing that God asked Israel to do. And I think this was meant to remind Israel of God's killing of the firstborn of Egypt. And in Exodus 13, verses 14 through 16 again, it says, "And it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, 'What is this?' Then you shall say to him, 'With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. It came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem.'" So it was meant to, as 16 goes on to say, serve as a sign. It was meant to remind Israel of the killing of the firstborn and how God used his great power to bring Israel out of Egypt and give them victory, in a sense, over their enemies. So that's what I've gathered from it.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the human capacity to be forgetful, to not remember that God would set up both of these things, Passover, which we talked about, but now the sacrifice or the redeeming of firstborn. It's possible that in chapters to come, Israel's going to need a constant reminder, and they'll probably forget to remember. And so this, I think, is meant to, it's a stopgap meant to prevent them from forgetting, prevent them from wandering away from the Lord.
So they were to do this as a sign. Verse 9 and verse 16, we read again about these things are to be a sign on their hand and on their forehead. How do you guys understand these statements? Is this literal markings that were there, or is this something else? And hypothetically, should we see language similar to this? How should we read that maybe in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't immediately take this literally, although, well, I'd have to get ahead to say. I'd have to jump ahead to say my next.
It's okay.
Don't tempt me. Greg's laying on the temptation. But I think that on your hand and forehead, I think there's it seems to me like that has a deeper meaning than a literal meaning. So I think I'm just gonna say for now, I don't think when he said it right then and there that he meant, to literally do something with your hand and your forehead. But I'll let Greg give the real explanation.
Oh goodness, let's not do that. I might give the funnier one. No, yeah, I definitely don't see these. There's no instruction to actually put a mark on your hand or on your forehead, or to put anything on your hand or on your forehead. These things. So I maybe symbolically is the way, but I don't even know that that's the right word. These are supposed to be such a constant reminder. It's as if there's a mark on your hand that you can't help but see, or on your forehead, so that other people can, if I'm talking to Joe and Joe's got a big bleeding mark on his forehead, like I'm not looking him in the eyes anymore. I'm paying attention to that mark that's on his forehead.
Are you hearkening us back to our last episode and Eric's mark that he had?
Oh, no, not at all.
No?
Yeah,
Which is gone, by the way.
Which is gone, by the way. A miraculous healing. No, I had actually forgotten all about that. And so as we see similar language in the future, I just want to point out to us that this is here and now, serving in a particular way. How does that relate to potential future uses?
Well, should we see language like this in the future, we'll have to remember to come back here maybe and revisit some of this. So at least for now, it does seem like their actions themselves, at the very least, maybe not a physical marking, but the actions are serving as a reminder, a tangible reminder. So there is something literally there, but maybe not a literal mark on the forehead and a literal mark on the hand, at least possibly. So in verse 17, we see that God is leading the Israelites out by a very certain route. And some of the statements that are made there, some might interpret that as saying God wasn't sure about how the Israelites would respond. Others maybe would read it differently. What do you guys think about God's conduct here in leading his people out by this particular route, and some of the statements that he makes about, maybe if they see war, that might influence them a certain way. So let's go ahead and go this different way instead.
I did a little bit of digging, and because I had read this verse many times before, and I always, I thought, well, what does he mean might? Because doesn't he know? Uh, is he uncertain about this?
He knows they might.
Well, he's certain they might. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Now the word might, it comes from the Hebrew word pen, P-E-N, meaning lest, otherwise, or for fear that. That's from the Strong's lexicon. And God elsewhere used pen to speak of certainties. For example, in Genesis chapter 3, he uses the same, it's the same Hebrew word there. And Genesis 3:3 says, and actually this is Eve quoting God, it says, "But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die." Now, I think I'm not sure if it's other translations actually use the word might. I think the word, the Hebrew word is pen here. But this is not describing something that is a possibility or an uncertainty. It's describing something that's guaranteed. It will happen. If you do eat from the tree, you're going to die. There's no question about that. So the word might does not necessarily imply doubt. Sometimes it does. And I think for our for the sake of our viewers, it's important to remember that, like English words, Hebrew words, Greek words have sometimes multiple meanings. They don't always mean only one thing. And this is just another example where the word might can refer to absolute certainty. It does not necessarily imply doubt. And I think as we read the rest of Scripture, we'll come to see that, that God does actually know the future, and he did know, he knew Israel's heart. He knew what they would do if they were faced with war, and so he knew better, and he sent them another route. So I don't think we have to conclude that the word might here implies some kind of doubt or uncertainty.
Sure. I can see that. I can read that sentence with less, I don't know, maybe contingency, less hanging on the word, less question on the word might there. I can read that way. I can read that as in some, like the temptation to turn back will be compelling, that some will, some won't, some might, I suppose. And so what I don't want to do is read that the people are always functioning as one cohesive whole, that some would turn back, some would succumb to that temptation. But I think this does open up the conversation to a conversation we've had in the past about God's knowledge. See our former published works, and as I begin more and more to subscribe to Joe's zipper theory on knowledge, I'll call it that. I without trying to break all into that, unless we want to, I don't. If Joe's way of looking at knowledge is, and specifically God's knowledge, is correct, this text immediately resolves itself. So I don't know I'm not going to explain your theory there, Joe, because that's your theory, not my theory. So
it's not simply unique to me. I mean, there are some, philosophers in the realm of epistemology that have defined knowledge. Certainly.
Say other philosophers.
So you want to include me as a philosopher? I guess that is fair. Other philosophers have defined this, and I think I can't necessarily improve upon it, but I do think that certainly even with that, and if we get into that, we'll talk away all of our time. I want to affirm what Eric said. I don't think that any of that should ever cause us to think that God doesn't know the future. So I think that people have gotten themselves into trouble by overly rigidly defining certain things that maybe doesn't account for what you were just describing, how a mixed multitude of peoples will respond. We shouldn't think that everybody will have singleness of heart and mind, that they'll all respond in a particular way. And yet God knows all of that, and in that he has some wisdom saying, yeah, I'm going to lead them this way, lest they want to turn back to Egypt. And we might see that they still want to go back to Egypt, even in the route that they go, but that it's not as quick, and it's for different reasons. And so God's knowledge is complete and exhaustive, and certainly if anybody hasn't watched our other published works, I don't want them to think that I question God's exhaustive knowledge. But I do think that there are ways that, yes, that do resolve some of the quote-unquote difficulties that we see that don't require us to do violence to the text. And it often comes down to something that you remind us to do all the time as well, to define our terms. Sometimes the difficulties exist simply because we haven't done that initial work. We think we know what words mean, and what Eric was just saying, Hebrew words, Greek words, English words, sometimes we have these overlap. We just think we know what everything means without actually doing the usage. And so if you think that lest, for example, only means uncertainty and doesn't mean certainty, well, Genesis 3:3 is a good example that this word, although you might think that it means uncertainty, actually can mean absolute certainty, at least in some context. Now, does that mean it means absolute certainty here? Well, no, but it's at least worth paying attention to. And words are amazing, that they can express things from very concrete to very abstract thoughts. And so it's not always as simple as we think, especially when we think we know what a word means and we've never really actually defined it. So anyway, I've already gone well beyond. Greg, you successfully tempted me into at least talking more about that than I was planning to. So let's move on for the sake of time, lest all the rest of our episode slip through our fingers here. We see in verse 19 that Moses takes the bones of Joseph with him. Why did they bring Joseph's bones with them out of Egypt?
Yeah, the text actually explains why, but this is just to remind our viewers, just always remember what we've already read. Just remember what you've already read in the Bible, because a lot of what you've already read is gonna play into what you're reading now. But in Genesis 50, verse 25, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear to carry his bones with them when they left Egypt and entered the land of Canaan. So Moses is just keeping that promise. He's doing exactly what Joseph asked Israel to do. So I think it's just as simple as that.
Yeah, what I find more interesting, based upon our reading so far, where someone was buried was very, very important to them. This is a prime example of that. Why wasn't it important to the brothers? It doesn't seem like we aren't told that they were concerned. We aren't told that their bones left. We're told that Joseph's bones left. So it's an anomaly that I find more interesting than the fact that Joseph did exactly what came before him.
That is a curious thought. I've actually never really thought about his brothers not asking for the same treatment. But based on some of the things that we said in this episode, Joseph did seem exemplary in his willingness to understand God's faithfulness. And as he looked back to God's faithfulness, he believed that promise. And so he wanted to make sure that his bones were brought and that he was buried in the land of his ancestors. He did seem to care about that a great deal. And Greg, you've expressed elsewhere, it's something that I've expressed. I don't really care what people do with my bones. They can shoot it to the moon or, it doesn't matter. I think you expressed it'd be neat to get a Viking funeral or something. But,
absolutely.
But Joseph did have that desire to be buried with his forefathers in that land. And if his brothers expressed it, it wasn't recorded for us. And if they tried to take their bones as well, again, that detail is not included. But Joseph was very specific. And so that's I like the way you framed that. I hadn't really thought about that in comparison with his brothers. I'd only thought about it more along the lines of how Eric thought about it, which is also, I think, very interesting. But let's get to our last question for today. This chapter records God appearing. We've seen God appear in different forms already up to this point. Here he chooses to appear in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Any thoughts about this appearance, this form of God, as we round off this episode and discussion on Exodus 12 and 13?
So I can't give an original thought here, but I
never have.
Well,
are we supposed to?
I'm joining you by giving a non-original thought here. I thought this was interesting. I was reading a commentary. I was reading actually several, and one commentator said, "The Lord Himself did for the Israelites by preternatural means that which armies were obliged to do for themselves by natural agents. The Persians and Greeks used fire and smoke as signals in their marches, and in a well-known papyrus, the commander of an Egyptian expedition is called a flame in the darkness at the head of his soldiers. By this sign, then, of the pillar of cloud, the Lord showed himself as their leader and general. And other commentators actually said similar things. This was not the only one. There were others that said more or less the same thing. So I know I kind of cheated there, but I don't know. I thought that was interesting. Whether that's exactly why God did that or not, I'm not totally sure. But I think it's something that's at least worth considering.
Greg, did you know that well-known papyrus that made all those remarks?
Why? No, I didn't. I
guess it's maybe not that well known. But, Greg,
among scholars,
scholars. Sure. Well, I'm not among scholars.
None of us ever claim to be one of those.
No.
Greg, what do you think about this?
I think that we ought to pay very, very careful attention to any future revelations of God among the clouds or God as a fire. I think that as important as those events were, and I don't take away from Eric's argument at all, I do think this establishes the possibility of a pattern that we ought to pay very careful attention to as God continues to reveal himself to his people throughout time.
Sure. Well, that's well said. And Eric, I'm not making silly of your it's not well known to me either. And so those are things that I didn't know, but certainly in that culture that might make a lot of sense. And so something to consider for us as we talk about these things, and certainly for all of our viewers as well. That's what we think about these chapters. Certainly there is more to be said. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. We'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on any of the things that we discussed or anything that we didn't discuss that is interesting to you. So go ahead and feel free to leave your comments down there below. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, we would invite you to consider doing that. If you enjoyed the video, consider clicking the thumbs up button. I would tell you to consider clicking the thumbs down button, but I always get a head shake from the rest of the crew, so don't do that. There's lots of buttons. You can push those: share, comment, subscribe, the notification bell, if you like clicking those things. But until we see you again next time, be sure to get equipped to obey your King and to glorify your God.